Hello everyone, welcome back. We are continuing to read through the Wikipedia entry on the Tulsa Race Massacre. We're going to pick it up on the history of Wednesday, June 1st. Throughout the early morning hours, groups of armed white and black people squared off in gunfights. The fighting was concentrated along sections of the Frisco tracks, a dividing line between the black and white commercial districts. A rumor circulated that more black people were coming by train from Muskogee to help with an invasion of Tulsa. At one point, passengers on an incoming train were forced to take cover on the floor of the train cars as they had arrived in the midst of crossfire, with the train taking hits on both sides. Small groups of whites made brief forays by car into Greenwood, indiscriminately firing into businesses and residences. They often received return fire. Meanwhile, white rioters threw lighted oil rags into several buildings along Archer Street, igniting them. As unrest spread to other parts of the city, many middle-class white families who employed black people in their homes as live-in cooks and servants were accosted by white rioters. They demanded the families turn over their employees to be taken to detention centers around the city. Many white families complied, but those who refused were subjected to attacks and vandalism in turn. Fires begin. At around 1 a.m., the white mob began setting fires, mainly in businesses on commercial Archer Street at the southern edge of the Greenwood district. As news traveled among Greenwood residents in the early morning hours, many began to take up arms in defense of their neighborhood, while others began a mass exodus from the city. Throughout the night, both sides continued fighting, sometimes only sporadically. As crews from the Tulsa Fire Department arrived to put out fires, they were turned away at gunpoint. Scott Ellsworth makes the same claim, but his reference makes no mention of firefighters. Parrish gave only praise for the National Guard. Another reference Ellsworth gives to support the claim of holding firefighters at gunpoint is only a summary of events in which they suppressed the firing of guns by the rioters and disarmed them of their firearms. Yet another of his references states that they were fired upon by the white mob. Quote, "It would mean a fireman's life to turn a stream of water on one of those Negro buildings. They shot at us all morning when we were trying to do something, but none of the men were hit. There's not a chance in the world to get through that mob into the Negro district," unquote. By 4 a.m., an estimated 24 black-owned businesses had been set ablaze. Tulsa founder and Ku Klux Klan member W. Tate Brady participated in the riot as a night watchman. This land press reported that previously Brady led the Tulsa Outrage, the November 7, 1917 tarring and feathering of members of the Industrial Workers of the World, an incident understood to be economically and politically rather than racially motivated. Previous reports regarding Brady's character seemed favorable, and he hired black employees in his businesses. Daybreak. Upon sunrise, around 5 a.m., a train whistle sounded. Hirsch said it was a siren. Some rioters believed the sound to be a signal for the rioters to launch an all-out assault on Greenwood. A white man stepped out from behind the Frisco depot and was fatally shot by a sniper in Greenwood. Crowds of rioters poured from their shelter, on foot and by car, into the streets of the black neighborhood. 5 white men in a car led the charge, but were killed by a fusillade of gunfire before they had traveled 1 block. Overwhelmed by the sheer number of white attackers, the black residents retreated north on Greenwood Avenue to the edge of town. Chaos ensued as terrified residents fled. The rioters shot indiscriminately and killed many residents along the way. Splitting into small groups, they began breaking into houses and buildings, looting. Several residents later testified the rioters broke into occupied homes and ordered the residents out to the street, where they could be driven or forced to walk to detention centers. A rumor spread among the rioters that the New Zion Baptist Church was being used as a fortress and armory. Purportedly, 20 caskets full of rifles had been delivered to the church, though no evidence was found. Attack by air. Numerous eyewitnesses described airplanes carrying white assailants who fired rifles and dropped firebombs on buildings, homes, and fleeing families. The privately owned aircraft had been dispatched from the nearby Curtis Southwest field outside Tulsa. Law enforcement officials later said that the planes were to provide reconnaissance and to protect against a, quote, Negro uprising, unquote. Law enforcement personnel were thought to be aboard at least some flights. Eyewitness accounts, such as testimony from the survivors during commission hearings, and a manuscript by eyewitness and attorney Buck Colbert Franklin, discovered in 2015, said that in the morning of June 1st, at least, quote, 12 or more, unquote, planes circled the neighborhood and dropped, quote, burning turpentine balls, unquote, on an office building, a hotel, a filing station, and multiple other buildings. Men also fired rifles at black residents, gunning them down in the street. Richard S. Warner concluded in his submission to the Oklahoma Commission that contrary to later reports by claimed eyewitnesses of seeing explosions, there were no reliable evidence to support such attacks. Warner noted that while a number of newspapers targeted at black readers heavily reported the use of nitroglycerin, turpentine, and rifles from the planes, many cited anonymous sources of secondhand accounts. Beryl Ford, one of the preeminent historians of the disaster, concluded from his large collection of photographs that there was no evidence of any buildings damaged by explosions. Danny Gobble commended Warner on his efforts and supported his conclusions. State Representative Don Ross, born in Tulsa in 1941, however, dissented from the evidence presented in the report, concluding that bombs were in fact dropped from planes during the violence. Franklin's account. In 2015, a previously unknown eyewitness account of the events of May 31st, 1921, was discovered and subsequently obtained by the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. The 10-page typewritten letter was authored by Buck Colbert Franklin, noted Oklahoma attorney and father of John Hope Franklin. Notable quotes include, "Lurid flames roared and belched and licked their forked tongues into the air. Smoke ascended the sky in thick black volumes, and amid it all the planes, now a dozen more in number, still hummed and darted here and there with the agility of natural birds of the air. Planes circling in midair. They grew in number and hummed, darted, and dipped low. I could hear something like hail falling upon the top of my office building. Down East Archer, I saw the old Midway Hotel on fire, burning from its top, and then another and another and another building began to burn from their top. The sidewalks were literally covered with burning turpentine balls. I knew all too well where they came from, and I knew all too well why every burning building first caught fire from the top. I paused and waited for an opportune time to escape. Where is our splendid fire department with its half-dozen stations, I asked myself. Is the city in conspiracy with the mob? Franklin states that every time he saw a white man shot, he, quote, felt happy, unquote, and he, quote, swelled with pride and hope for the race, unquote. Franklin reports seeing multiple machine guns firing at night and hearing, quote, thousands of guns, unquote, being fired simultaneously from all directions. He states that he was arrested by, quote, 1,000 boys, it seemed, firing their guns every step they took. Arrival of National Guard troops. Adjutant General Charles Barrett of the Oklahoma National Guard arrived by special train at about 9:15 a.m. with 109 troops from Oklahoma City. Ordered in by the governor, he could not legally act until he had contacted all the appropriate local authorities, including Mayor T.D. Evans, the sheriff, and the police chief. Meanwhile, his troops paused to eat breakfast. Barrett summoned reinforcements from several other Oklahoma cities. Barrett declared martial law at 11:49 a.m., and by noon the troops had managed to suppress most of the remaining violence. Thousands of black residents had fled the city. Another 4,000 people had been rounded up and detained at various centers. Under martial law, the detainees were required to carry identification cards. As many as 6,000 black Greenwood residents were interned at 3 local facilities: Convention Hall, now known as Tulsa Theater, the Tulsa County Fairgrounds, then located about a mile northeast of Greenwood, and McNutty Park, a baseball stadium at 10th Street and Elgin Avenue. A 1921 letter from an officer of the Service Company, 3rd Infantry, Oklahoma National Guard, who arrived on May 31, 1921, reported numerous events related to the suppression of the riot. Taking about 30 to 40 black residents into custody, putting a machine gun on a truck and taking it on patrol, although it was not functioning and much less useful than, quote, an ordinary rifle, unquote. Being fired on from black snipers from the church, and, unquote, and returning fire. Being fired on by white men, turning the prisoners over to deputies to take them to police headquarters, being fired on again by armed black residents and having 2 NCOs slightly wounded, searching for black snipers and firearms, detailing an NCO to take 170 black residents to the civil authorities and delivering an additional 150 black residents to the Convention Hall. Captain John W. McCune reported that stockpiled ammunition within the burning structures began to explode, which might have further contributed to casualties. Martial law was withdrawn on June 4th under Field Order No. 7. Aftermath. The massacre was covered by national newspapers, and the reported number of deaths varies widely. On June 1, 1921, the Tulsa Tribune reported that 9 white people and 68 black people had died in the riot, but shortly afterwards it changed this number to a total of 176 dead. The next day, the same paper reported the count as 9 white people and 21 black people. The Los Angeles Express headline said, 175 killed, many wounded. The New York Times said that 77 people have been killed, including 68 black people, but it later lowered the total to 33. The Richmond Times-Dispatch of Virginia reported that 85 people, including 25 white people, were killed. It also reported that the police chief had reported to Governor Robertson that the total was 75, and that a police major put the figure at 175. The Oklahoma Department of Vital Statistics put the number of deaths at 36, 26 black and 10 white. Very few people, if any, died as a direct result of the fire. Official state records show 5 deaths by conflagration for the entire state in 1921. Walter Francis White of the NAACP traveled to Tulsa from New York and reported that, although officials and undertakers said that the fatalities numbered 10 white and 21 black, he estimated the number of dead to be 50 whites and between 150 and 200 blacks. He also reported that 10 white men were killed on Tuesday, 6 white men drove into the black section and never came out, and 13 whites were killed on Wednesday. He reported that Major O.T. Johnson of the Salvation Army in Tulsa said that 37 blacks were employed as gravediggers to bury 120 blacks in individual graves without coffins on Friday and Saturday. The Oklahoma Commission described John's statement being that his crew was over 3 dozen gravediggers who dug about 150 graves. Ground-penetrating radar was used to investigate the site purported to contain these mass graves. Multiple eyewitness reports and, quote, oral histories, unquote, suggested the graves could have been dug at 3 different cemeteries across the city. The sites were examined, and no evidence of ground disturbance indicated mass graves was found. However, at one site, ground disturbance was found in a 5-meter square area, but cemetery records indicate that 3 graves had been dug and bodies buried within this envelope before the riot. Oklahoma's 2001 commission into the riot provides multiple contradicting estimates. Goebel estimates 100 to 300 deaths, also stating right after that no one was prosecuted, even though nearly 100 were indicted. And Franklin and Ellsworth estimate 75 to 100 deaths and describe some of the higher estimates as dubious as the low estimates. C. Snow was able to confirm 39 casualties, all listed as male, although 4 were unidentifiable, 26 black and 13 white. The 13 white fatalities were all taken to hospitals. 11 of them had come from outside of Oklahoma, and possibly as many as half were petroleum industry workers. Only 8 of the 26 black fatalities were brought to hospitals, and as hospitals were segregated, and with the Black Thistle Memorial Hospital having burned down, the only place where the injured black people were treated was at the basement of the Morningside Hospital. Several hundred were injured. The Red Cross, in their preliminary overview, mentioned wide-ranging external estimates of 55 to 300 dead. However, because of the hurried nature of the undocumented burials, they declined to submit an official estimate stating the number of dead is a matter of conjecture. The Red Cross registered 8,624 persons. 183 were hospitalized, mostly for gunshot wounds or burns. They differentiate in their records on the basis of triage category, not the type of wound. While a further 531 required first aid or surgical treatment, 8 miscarriages were attributed to be a result of the tragedy. 19 died in care between June 1st and December 30th, 1921. Property losses. The commercial section of Greenwood was destroyed. Losses include 191 businesses, a junior high school, several churches, and the only hospital in the district. The Red Cross reported that 1,256 houses were burned, and another 215 were looted but not burned. The Tulsa Real Estate Exchange estimated property losses amounted to $1.5 million in real estate and $750,000 in personal property, equivalent to a total of $33 million in 2020. The Red Cross reported on December 1921 estimated that 10,000 people were made homeless by the destruction. Over the next year, local citizens filed more than 1.8 million, equivalent to 26 million, in riot-related claims against the city. Identities of the black victims. On June 3rd, the Morning Tulsa Daily Word reported major points of their interview with Deputy Sheriff Barney Cleaver concerning the events leading up to the Tulsa riot. Cleaver was Deputy Sheriff for Okmulgee County and not under the supervision of the city police departments. His duties mainly involved enforcing law among, quote, the colored people, unquote, of Greenwood, but he also operated a business as a private investigator. He had previously been dismissed as a city police investigator for assisting county officers with a drug raid at Gurley's Hotel, but not reporting his involvement to his superiors. He had considerable land holdings and suffered tremendous financial damage as a result of the riot. Among his holdings were several residential properties and Cleaver Hall, a large community gathering place and function hall. He reported personally evicting a number of armed criminals who had taken to barricading themselves within properties he owned. Upon eviction, they immediately moved to Cleaver Hall. Cleaver reported that the majority of violence started at Cleaver Hall among the rioters barricaded inside. Charles Page offered to build him a new home. The Morning Tulsa Daily World stated, quote, Cleaver claimed Will Robertson, a dope peddler and all-around bad Negro, as the leader of the armed blacks. He has also the names of 3 others who were in the armed gang at the house. The rest of the Negroes participated in the fight, he says, were former servicemen who had an exaggerated idea of their own importance. They did not belong there, had no regular employment, and were simply a floating element with seemingly no ambition in life but to foment trouble, unquote. O.W. Gurley, owner of Gurley's Hotel, identified the following 6 men by name as arming themselves and gathering in his hotel: Will Robinson, Pegleg Taylor, Bud Bassett, Henry Van Dyke, Chester Ross, Jake Mays, Obie Mann, John Supplesocks, Fatty, Jack Scott, Lee Mabel, Joe Bowman, and S.W. Weaver. Public Safety Committee. By June 6th, the Associated Press reported that a Citizens Public Safety Committee had been established, made up of 250 white men who vowed to protect the city and to put down any more disturbance. A white man was shot and killed that day after he failed to stop as ordered by a National Guardsman. Rebuilding. Governor James B.A. Robertson had gone to Tulsa during the riot to ensure order was restored. Before returning to the capital, he ordered an inquiry of events, especially of the city and sheriff's office. He called for a grand jury to be impaneled, and Judge Valjean Bidinson said that its investigation would begin June 8th. The jury was selected by June 9th. Judge Bidinson expected that the state attorney general would call numerous witnesses, both black and white, given the large scale of the riot. State Attorney General S.P. Freeling initiated the investigation, and witnesses were heard over 12 days. In the end, the all-white jury attributed the black riot to the black mobs, while noting that law enforcement officials had failed in preventing the riot. A total of 27 cases were brought before the court, and the jury indicted more than 85 individuals. In the end, no one was convicted of charges for the deaths, injuries, or property damage. On June 3rd, a total of over 1,000 businessmen and civic leaders met, resolving to form a committee to raise funds and aid in rebuilding Greenwood. Judge J. Martin, a former mayor of Tulsa, was chosen as the chairman of the group. He said at the mass meeting, quote, Tulsa can only redeem herself from the countrywide shame and humiliation into which she is today plunged by complete restitution and rehabilitation of the destroyed Black Belt. The rest of the United States must know that the real citizenship of Tulsa weeps at this unspeakable crime and will make good the damage so far as it can be done to the last penny. Many black families spent the winter of 1921-1922 in tents as they worked to rebuild. Charles Page was commended for his philanthropic efforts in the wake of the riot and the assistance of, quote, destitute blacks, unquote. A group of influential white developers persuaded the city to pass a fire ordinance that would have prohibited many black people from rebuilding in Greenwood. Their intention was to redevelop Greenwood for more businesses and industrial use and force black people further to the edge of the city for residences. The case was litigated and appealed to the Oklahoma Supreme Court by Buck Colbert Franklin, where the ordinance was ruled as unconstitutional. Most of the promised funding was never raised for the black residents, and they struggled to rebuild after the violence. Willows, the regional director of the Red Cross, noted this in his report, explaining his slow initial progress to facilitate the rehabilitation of the refugees. The fire code was officially intended to prevent another tragedy by banning wooden frame construction houses in place of previously burnt homes. A concession was granted to allow temporary wood frame dwellings while a new building, which would meet the more restrictive fire code, was being constructed. This was quickly halted as residents within 2 weeks had started to erect full-size wooden frame buildings in contravention of the agreement. It took a further 2-month delay securing the court decision to reinstate the previous fire code. Willows heavily criticized the Tulsa city officials for interfering with his efforts for the role in the Public Welfare Committee, which first sought to rezone the burned area as industrial, and for constructing a Union Station in its place with no consideration for the refugees. Then he criticized them again for the dissolution of the Public Welfare Committee in favor of the formation of the Reconstruction Committee, which failed to formulate a single plan, leaving the dispatched residents prohibited from beginning reconstruction efforts for several months. Tulsa Union Depot. Despite the Red Cross's best efforts to assist with the reconstruction of Greenwood's residential area, the considerably altered present-day layout of the district and its surrounding neighborhoods, as well as the extensive redevelopment of Greenwood by people unaffiliated with the neighborhood prior to the riot, stand as proof that the Red Cross relief efforts had limited success. Tulsa's main industry at the time of the riot were banking, BOK Financial Corporation, administrative, Penwell, Oklahoma National Gas Company, and petroleum engineering services, Skelly Oil, earning Tulsa the title of, quote, oil capital of the world, unquote. Joshua Cosden is regarded as a founder of the city, having constructed the tallest building in Tulsa, the Cosden Building. The construction of the Cosden Building and Union Depot were overseen by the Manhattan Construction Company, which is based in Tulsa. Francis Rooney is the great-grandson and beneficiary of the estate of Lawrence H. Rooney, founder of the Manhattan Construction Company. City planners immediately saw the fire that destroyed homes and businesses across Greenwood as a fortunate event for advancing their objectives, meanwhile showing a disregard for the welfare of affected residents. Plans were made to rezone the burned area for industrial use. The Tulsa Daily World reported that the mayor and city commissioners expressed that, quote, a large industrial section will be found desirable in causing a wider separation between Negroes and whites, unquote. The Reconstruction Committee organized a forum to discuss the proposal with community leaders and stakeholders. Naming, among others, O.W. Gurley, Reverend H.T.F. Johnson, and Barney Cleaver as participants in the forum, it was reported that all members were in agreement that the plan to redevelop the burned district as an industrial section and agreed that the proposed Union Station project was desirable. Quote, not a note of dissension was expressed, unquote. The article states that these community leaders would again meet at the First Baptist Church in the following days. The Black Dispatch described the content of the following meeting at the First Baptist Church. At the First Baptist Church, the Reconstruction Committee had intended to have the black landholders sign over their property to a holding company managed by black representatives on behalf of the city. The properties were then to be turned over to a white appraisal committee, which would pay residents for the residential zoned land at the lower industrial zoned value in advance of the rezoning. Professor J.W. Hughes addressed the white Reconstruction Committee members in opposition to their proposition, coining a slogan which would come to galvanize the community. Quote, I'm going to hold what I have until I get what I've lost, unquote. Construction of the Tulsa Union Depot, a large central rail hub connecting three major railroads, began in Greenwood less than 2 years after the riot. Prior to the riot, construction had already been underway for a smaller rail hub nearby. However, in the aftermath of the riot, land on which homes and businesses had been destroyed by the fires suddenly became available, allowing for a larger train depot near the heart of the city to be built in Greenwood instead. Okay, I'm going to call it there for right now. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate you following along with me. If you wouldn't mind giving the channel a subscribe and the video a like, that would really help me out. Thank you so much.